My name is Alyssa Estrada, and I will be going over Ivan Pavlov and his theory over classical conditioning. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who was very invested in behavioral psychology. He was born on September 14, 1849 in Russia, in a town where his father, Peter Pavlov, was a priest. He was educated first at the church school in Russia and then at the theological seminary there. Pavlov was from a very religious family and trained for priesthood, but eventually left the seminary for science studies at St. Petersburg's University. During the 1890s, Ivan Pavlov was looking at how dogs began to salivate in response to being fed. He first started this theory when he noticed that his dogs would begin to salivate whenever he entered the room, even though he did not have food for him. He began to experiment the way dogs produce saliva and how they presented certain stimulus. This essentially led him to the theorization of conditioned reflex. With this type of experiment and others he established, he applied this discovery and tested it on humans. Pavlov then came up with the term classical conditioning, also referred to as Pavlovian conditioning. In the next slides, I will give you more insight on how classical conditioning works and how his theory was formed. Classical conditioning has three stages: before conditioning, during conditioning, and after conditioning. Classical conditioning involves in learning to associate an unconditioned stimulus that brings about a specific response with a new conditioned stimulus, so that a new stimulus brings out the same response. The first stage would be an unconditioned stimulus, which is where one unnaturally triggers a feedback. It would then produce an unconditioned response, which is where an unlearned response occurs in a reaction that is linked to the unconditioned stimulus. We then have the second stage, which is during conditioning, which would be when a stimulus is produced but has no response, which is correlate with an unconditioned response, which then becomes a conditioned stimulus. Pavlov's third stage, which is after conditioning, is where the conditioned stimulus has been correlated with the unconditioned stimulus to generate a conditioned response. This powerful theorist essentially changed the world and broadened up perspectives on how behaviors occur and how it is enhanced. In summary, there are two aspects for before conditioning. Food, which is the unconditioned stimulus, will have a response of salvation, which is the unconditioned response. A bell will be provided, which is the neutral stimulus, and will respond to no salvation, which is the no conditioned response. During conditioning, a bell and the food will be provided for the dog, and the response will be salvation, which is the unconditioned response. After conditioning, the bell will be the conditioned stimulus, which will have a response of salvation, which is the conditioned response. A way that I would implement this theory in a classroom is how I present myself to the students. In this case, it is known that most instructors tend to remain at the front of the classroom to give the lecture. This allows the students to become distracted by doing things that are not being conducted in class. For example, if an instructor remains at the front of the class in the same spot the whole duration of the class, then the student will feel they are able to use their phone to text or use their computers to enter websites that have nothing to do with the class or lecture. If the instructor enables proximity, that will alert the students. In this case, I would move around the classroom, standing next to or behind students that I am aware they are pursuing other activities that distract them from my lecture. As I continue to walk around the classroom, the behavior of doing other activities from students will less likely to continue. A way I would incorporate this theory is by encouraging a positive environment, which will result in a decrease of the amount of student misbehavior. It is essential that I reassure my students why they are learning and comprehending the material by putting the students into groups, going over what the lecture is about. A good environment in applying classical conditioning with students is making them feel like the instructor cares. There might be a slight chance where an instructor merely teaches for the paycheck, so if they do not put the whole heart into the subject they are teaching, it will show the students to see that the instructor is there merely to do their job and not their passion. Another example is when the instructor remains silent once they start to hear students speaking as they are lecturing. Students might think the instructor lost their train of thought. Every time the instructor remains quiet as the noise volume increases, the students will eventually learn to become quiet as the instructor stops lecturing.
created using Powtoon.